Natalie Brooks stood near the edge of her childhood backyard, holding a paper plate she had already forgotten about, when the sound of shattering glass split the late summer air. A beer bottle flew past her face and smashed against the wooden fence behind her, spraying foam and amber shards across the grass. Before I continue, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. Your one click really helps support the channel. Conversations died instantly. The smell of grilled meat mixed with sharp hops, and for a second, no one breathed. Natalie's heart hammered as she turned slowly, already knowing who had thrown it. Ethan Brooks stood a few feet away, his chest rising fast, his jaw locked in rage. Around them, folding chairs scraped backward. Their mother, Susan, burst into sobs, covering her mouth as if she had just watched a car accident. Their father, Richard, froze with a burger halfway to his lips, eyes wide, unable to process what he was seeing. The backyard, once filled with laughter, cousins, and clinking glasses, felt suddenly exposed and fragile, like a stage after the curtain had been ripped down. Natalie felt the familiar childhood instinct to shrink, to apologize, to disappear. Instead, she stood still. The bottle had missed her, but the intent behind it had not. Across the yard, their grandfather Henry leaned forward in his lawn chair, studying Ethan with unsettling calm, as if he had been waiting for this moment longer than anyone realized. The explosion had been triggered by a sentence Natalie hadn't even meant to announce. She had been speaking quietly with her cousin Megan, answering a casual question about work. "I closed on another rental last week," Natalie had said, her voice neutral, almost cautious. "It's a small 4-unit place. Long-term hold." She hadn't raised her voice or looked around for attention. She didn't need validation. Real estate had become routine for her: numbers, inspections, financing, patience. But Ethan had heard her anyway. He stopped laughing mid-story with one of his friends and stared across the yard like someone had insulted him publicly. "That's a lie," he snapped as he walked over, beer clenched too tightly in his hand. "You work an office job and rent a tiny apartment. You want people to think you're successful now." Natalie had looked at him, surprised by how little he knew about her life. "I'm not lying," she said evenly. "I've been investing for years." That was when his face flushed red. "You don't get to pretend you're better than me," Ethan said, and the bottle left his hand. Now, with the evidence scattered behind her, Natalie realized this wasn't jealousy. It was panic. Something inside Ethan had cracked the moment her success became visible. Growing up in the Brooks household meant understanding one unspoken rule: Ethan always came first. Natalie learned it at 18, when acceptance letters arrived on the same afternoon. Ethan's envelope, stamped with an Ivy League crest, was opened immediately. Cheers filled the kitchen. Susan called relatives. Richard pulled a bottle of champagne from the basement, save for what he called a moment that matters. Natalie's own letter, from a local community college, sat unopened on the counter for 3 days. When she finally enrolled, no one asked what she planned to study. The pattern never changed. Ethan received praise for potential. Natalie was expected to be practical and quiet. At 17, Ethan was handed the keys to a new BMW, parked like a trophy in the driveway. Natalie was working 2 jobs, saving for a used car with a broken radio and no air conditioning. She didn't complain. She learned. While Ethan collected titles he hadn't earned, Natalie collected skills: budgeting, patience, discipline. She paid her way through school at night while working during the day. By the time Ethan was handed a management role in their father's company, Natalie had graduated debt-free and moved on without fanfare. No applause followed her. She didn't wait for it. Natalie built her life quietly. At 25, she bought her first rental, a modest house that needed work and attention. She painted walls on weekends, fixed leaking sinks, learned from mistakes. The rent covered the mortgage. She reinvested every extra dollar. 2 years later came the second property, then the third. She lived below her means, tracked numbers obsessively, and never mentioned it at family dinners. Meanwhile, Ethan lived in his parents' guest room well into adulthood, driving his BMW to a job where his title mattered more than his effort. Their father defended him. "He's under pressure," Richard said whenever someone questioned Ethan's role. Natalie never argued. She had stopped competing with Ethan long ago. That was why the barbecue felt different. Her success had crossed a line simply by existing out loud. As the yard filled with whispers and uneasy glances, Natalie noticed Henry Brooks pushing himself upright from his chair. Her grandfather moved slowly, but his eyes were sharp. The chatter didn't return. Even the children had gone quiet. Henry cleared his throat once, deliberately. Ethan scoffed, unaware that the ground beneath him was about to collapse. Henry Brooks looked directly at Ethan, ignoring the broken glass, the crying, the stunned faces. "You're angry because your sister succeeded without stealing," he said calmly. The sentence landed heavier than the bottle ever could have. Ethan's confidence evaporated. Richard dropped his burger. Susan stopped crying mid-sob. Henry reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a thick envelope, worn at the edges. "I've been reviewing the company books for months," he continued. "You've been taking money that isn't yours." Ethan laughed nervously. "That's insane," he said. "You don't know what you're talking about." Henry placed the envelope on the table and opened it. $8,000 to $7,000, he said. "Forged invoices. Fake expenses. Cash diverted into personal accounts." Natalie felt the air leave her lungs. This was bigger than jealousy. Bigger than family rivalry. Richard stared at the documents, color draining from his face as recognition set in. Susan whispered Ethan's name like a prayer. The backyard felt impossibly small now, trapped inside the weight of truth. Natalie realized her offhand comment hadn't caused anything. It had exposed something already rotting beneath the surface. And as Ethan backed away from the table, eyes darting, she understood that this was only the beginning. The silence after Henry's accusation stretched until it became unbearable. Ethan's mouth opened, then closed again, his earlier rage replaced by calculation. "This is ridiculous," he said finally, forcing a laugh that convinced no one. "You're confused. Grandpa, you don't understand how corporate expenses work." Henry didn't respond immediately. He slid the documents closer to Richard, who picked them up with shaking hands. As Richard scanned the pages, his breathing grew shallow. He recognized the signatures, his signatures, or what looked exactly like them. "I never approved these," Richard said quietly. "I specifically rejected this equipment order." Henry nodded. "Because it was never real. The vendor doesn't exist." Susan stood abruptly, knocking over her chair. "Ethan wouldn't steal from his own family," she said, her voice cracking. "There has to be another explanation." Natalie watched her brother carefully. He wasn't confused. He wasn't shocked. He was cornered. "You've always hated me," Ethan snapped suddenly, turning toward Natalie. "You're jealous. You put him up to this." Natalie shook her head slowly. "I didn't know any of this existed," she said. "I don't even have access to the company accounts." Henry exhaled sharply. "Enough," he said. "This isn't about sibling rivalry. This is theft." The word hung in the air like smoke. Around them, family members drifted away in uneasy clusters, pretending not to listen while hearing every word. The barbecue had transformed into something else entirely, a reckoning unfolding in public, where lies could no longer hide behind charm or entitlement. Ethan retreated into the house that night without another word, slamming the door behind him. The party dissolved quickly after that. No one stayed to eat dessert. Broken glass was swept away in silence. Natalie drove home with her hands tight on the steering wheel, replaying the moment Henry had spoken. She slept poorly, her mind cycling through disbelief and dread. By morning, the situation had shifted from emotional chaos to something colder and more dangerous. Richard spent the next 2 days at the office with Henry, pulling records, calling the company accountant, locking down accounts. The numbers told a brutal story. The theft hadn't started recently. It had grown, small at first, then bolder. When Richard finally called Natalie, his voice sounded older. "We need to talk," he said. They met at the dining room table where so many family decisions had been made before. "Ethan says Grandpa is wrong," Susan said weakly. "He says someone else manipulated the records." Natalie felt a chill. "Who?" she asked. Susan hesitated. "He didn't say." That night, Ethan requested a family meeting. His message was polished, confident. Natalie sensed the danger immediately. This wasn't remorse. It was preparation. When she arrived, Ethan sat at the table with a leather briefcase neatly arranged in front of him. He smiled as if he were presenting a business proposal. "I figured out what happened," he said. "And I'm afraid the truth is worse than we thought." Natalie's stomach tightened. Whatever Ethan was about to do, he had planned it carefully. And she was certain she was about to become the target. Ethan opened the briefcase slowly and laid out documents across the table, invoices, emails, bank statements. "The money didn't go to me," he said smoothly. "It went to Natalie."
Susan gasped.
Richard stared at the papers, stunned. Ethan pointed to highlighted sections. She created a fake vendor, he continued. A landscaping company. Payments were routed to an account linked to her identity. Natalie stood up so abruptly her chair scraped loudly against the floor.
That's a lie, she said.
I've never owned a landscaping business.
Ethan met her eyes calmly.
The evidence says otherwise. The documents looked disturbingly real.
Official logos.
Transaction dates. Detailed descriptions.
Natalie's heart pounded as she realized how dangerous this was. This wasn't denial. It was a frame-up.
We need an independent investigation, Natalie said, forcing steadiness into her voice. A forensic accountant.
Ethan smirked.
That won't help you.
That was when Henry spoke again.
It will, he said firmly. Because lies collapse under scrutiny.
Natalie contacted a forensic accountant the next morning.
Her name was Melissa Carter, and she listened without interruption as Natalie explained everything. After reviewing the documents, Melissa leaned back in her chair.
These are sophisticated forgeries, she said.
But they are still forgeries. Natalie felt her first breath of relief in days.
Can you prove it? She asked. Melissa nodded.
Absolutely. And for the first time since the bottle shattered, Natalie knew the truth would survive, if she stayed calm long enough to let it be seen. Melissa worked fast. Metadata revealed the documents had been created days ago, not years earlier.
Fonts didn't match historical records. Email headers were fabricated.
Bank routing trails looped back to shell accounts registered under false credentials. Worse, phone records showed Ethan had contacted a private investigator weeks earlier. He hadn't just reacted to being exposed, he had planned this. When Natalie returned to her parents' house with Melissa's findings, the mood shifted from confusion to horror. He was going to have you arrested, Richard said quietly, reading the report. Susan covered her face. I don't understand how this happened, she whispered.
Henry's expression was grim.
It happened because no one ever told him no. The final family meeting was brief and devastating. Melissa presented her findings calmly, professionally, dismantling Ethan's story piece by piece. Ethan tried to interrupt, then deflect, then blame stress.
None of it worked. When cornered, he finally admitted part of the truth. I took the money, he said.
But I was desperate.
He didn't apologize. He justified.
That was when Susan revealed the final truth. She and Richard had known about Ethan's gambling debts.
They had known he was planning to shift blame. They had hoped to stop him quietly.
Natalie felt something break inside her.
You knew, she said softly. No one answered.
That silence hurt more than the accusation ever had. The family wasn't just confronting Ethan's crimes.
They were confronting years of fear-driven silence that had allowed those crimes to grow.
The moment that ended everything came when Ethan reached for sympathy one last time.
He claimed he couldn't live with the shame. He held up a bottle of pills with shaking hands.
Susan rushed toward him, sobbing. Richard froze. Natalie stepped closer and looked carefully.
The pills were white, round, familiar.
Those are vitamin C tablets, she said. Ethan's hand faltered.
The room went still. Melissa spoke quietly. This is manipulation, she said.
Not despair.
Ethan dropped the pills. The act was over. There were no more stories left to tell. That night, Richard contacted the authorities.
Charges followed quickly: embezzlement, fraud, obstruction. Ethan was arrested at the office while attempting to delete records.
The fallout was brutal, but clean.
Truth had finally replaced confusion. As Natalie stood alone later in the quiet backyard, she understood something clearly for the first time. Her success hadn't caused this collapse.
It had survived it. And what came next wouldn't be about revenge or victory.
It would be about rebuilding, slowly, honestly, without lies. Ethan's arrest marked the end of denial and the beginning of consequences. News traveled quickly through extended family and business circles, stripping away the protective silence that had surrounded him for years. Richard shut down operations for 2 days, handing full access to investigators and auditors. The company survived, but its reputation took a visible hit. Natalie stayed away from the chaos, focusing on her work, though sleep remained elusive. She replayed moments from childhood, missed conversations, unasked questions, warnings ignored. When Ethan finally called from detention, Natalie let it go to voicemail.
She wasn't ready to hear his voice.
Susan oscillated between grief and guilt, struggling to accept that protecting Ethan had ultimately endangered Natalie.
I thought love meant shielding him, she admitted one evening. Natalie didn't argue. She understood now that love without boundaries wasn't love at all.
Henry visited Natalie quietly one afternoon, sitting across from her at a cafe.
You did nothing wrong, he said firmly.
Standing in truth always feels lonely at first.
His certainty grounded her.
For the first time since the incident, Natalie felt steady.
She wasn't responsible for Ethan's choices. She never had been.
That realization was painful, but freeing. The legal process moved faster than anyone expected. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Ethan accepted a plea agreement. 18 months in a minimum security facility.
Restitution. Probation.
Mandatory treatment for gambling addiction.
Susan cried through the hearing.
Richard stared straight ahead, jaw tight, absorbing the cost of his silence.
Natalie didn't attend.
She read the outcome later, alone, and felt neither triumph nor sorrow, only closure. Life continued. Natalie expanded her real estate portfolio with careful confidence, channeling stress into focus. She bought 2 more properties within the year and began mentoring other women interested in financial independence.
Work grounded her.
Progress reminded her that stability was earned, not inherited. Meanwhile, family therapy began. Awkward, uncomfortable, necessary. Conversations surfaced years of favoritism and fear-driven decisions. Susan admitted she had mistaken guilt for devotion. Richard acknowledged that giving Ethan power without accountability had been a failure of leadership. Natalie spoke less than the others, listening, choosing words carefully.
Healing wasn't loud. It was deliberate.
Trust wasn't restored through apologies, but through changed behavior over time. Prison stripped Ethan of the illusions that had sustained him. There were no titles, no shortcuts, no family influence. Counseling forced him to confront patterns he had always avoided: entitlement, manipulation, resentment. Months passed before he wrote Natalie a letter.
It wasn't dramatic.
It didn't ask for forgiveness. He acknowledged planning to frame her. He admitted that fear and pride had driven him to betrayal. I wanted to survive, he wrote, even if it meant destroying you. Natalie read it twice, then set it aside. The honesty unsettled her more than the crime itself. When Ethan was released, strict boundaries were set. He moved into transitional housing, not home. He found work as a laborer, earning hourly wages under supervision.
The work humbled him. He showed up early. He followed instructions. No one knew his past unless he chose to tell it.
Natalie watched from a distance, cautious but observant. Change, she knew, wasn't proven through words. It revealed itself slowly, through consistency. And for the first time, Ethan seemed willing to do the work without an audience. 2 years later, the family gathered again in the same backyard, this time for Henry's birthday.
The fence had been repaired. The lawn looked healthier.
The tension was different, present, but honest. Ethan stood beside the grill, quieter now, attentive, no longer performing. When he spoke, people listened, not because of status, but because his words carried restraint. At one point, he asked to address everyone. Natalie felt her shoulders tense but stayed. I spent years thinking I was owed success, Ethan said. When I failed, I blamed everyone else. Especially my sister.
He looked at Natalie directly.
She earned everything I tried to steal.
There was no applause. Just silence and respect.
Later, Ethan approached Natalie privately. I don't expect forgiveness, he said. But I want to earn the right to be better.
Natalie nodded. It wasn't forgiveness.
It was permission, for effort, not absolution. That was enough for now. As evenings settled and candles were lit for Henry, Natalie watched her family with new clarity. They were imperfect, bruised, but honest in ways they had never been before. The golden child illusion was gone.
In its place stood accountability.
Natalie understood now that growth often arrives through rupture, not comfort. Her success hadn't fractured the family, it had revealed what was already broken and forced repair to begin. As laughter returned cautiously and Henry blew out his candles, Natalie felt grounded in something real.
She hadn't won anything. She had survived truth.
And that, she knew, was stronger than approval, louder than jealousy, and permanent in ways lies could never be. In the months after Henry's birthday, the Brooks family settled into a quieter rhythm. There were no dramatic breakthroughs, only steady adjustments. Richard restructured the company with external oversight and stepped back from daily operations, accepting that trust now required systems, not assumptions. Susan focused on rebuilding her relationship with Natalie through small, consistent acts, calls without agendas, visits without comparisons, apologies without excuses. Natalie appreciated the effort but remained careful.
She had learned that closeness without boundaries invited confusion.
Her own life continued to expand in practical ways. She launched a small consulting service to help first-time investors navigate property purchases responsibly. The work felt meaningful, not because it proved anything to her family, but because it aligned with who she had become. For the first time, Natalie felt fully self-directed. The past still existed, but it no longer defined her daily choices. She wasn't reacting anymore. She was building. Ethan kept his distance, intentionally. He attended counseling, maintained his job, and honored the conditions set by the court and his family.
There were no grand gestures.
When he visited, he arrived on time and left early.
He listened more than he spoke.
Natalie noticed the difference in small moments, the way he accepted correction without defensiveness, the way he asked questions instead of asserting answers. One afternoon, he helped Henry repair a loose step in the backyard. No instructions were given.
No praise was expected. The work was slow and careful.
Henry watched him quietly, then nodded once. It was the closest thing to approval Ethan had received in years. Natalie observed from the window, feeling neither resentment nor pride, only cautious acceptance. This version of Ethan wasn't familiar yet, but it was real. That mattered more than intention. Time did what confrontation could not. It softened sharp edges without erasing memory. Family dinners resumed, smaller and simpler. Conversations stayed grounded. When mistakes happened, they were addressed instead of ignored.
Susan learned to pause before intervening. Richard learned to ask instead of assume.
Natalie learned that forgiveness was not a single decision, but a process tied to safety and trust. She allowed herself moments of distance without guilt. She also allowed moments of connection without fear. Balance replaced obligation. The family no longer revolved around one person's needs. That shift changed everything. 3 years after the barbecue, Natalie stood again in the backyard, watching Henry laugh with her nieces and nephews. The space felt lighter, not because the past had been erased, but because it was no longer hidden. Ethan joined them briefly, then stepped aside, content to observe. Natalie realized something important in that moment. Accountability had not destroyed the family.
It had clarified it.
Everyone now stood where they belonged, not above, not beneath, just present. The illusion of favoritism had been replaced with fairness.
That fairness wasn't dramatic. It was steady.
Later that evening, Ethan approached Natalie quietly.
"Thank you," he said. She waited.
"For not protecting me from consequences," he continued. "It saved me." Natalie considered his words before seeing his gaze.
"Your choices did that," she replied.
"I just didn't lie for you." Ethan nodded, accepting the truth without flinching. There was no reconciliation speech, no emotional release.
Just understanding.
And that was enough. As the night wound down and chairs were folded away, Natalie felt a calm certainty settle in her chest. The family she stood among was imperfect, honest, and finally real. She had learned that love without boundaries was fragile, but love anchored in truth could survive almost anything. Success, she realized, wasn't what triggered the collapse, it was what exposed it.
And accountability hadn't ended the family. It had saved it.
Natalie turned off the porch light and stepped inside, knowing that the strongest foundations, whether in homes, businesses, or families, were built not on silence or favoritism, but on integrity that held firm when tested. Sometimes love isn't protection, it's accountability. When the truth finally comes out, it doesn't break families. It shows them what needs to change. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Also, don't forget to subscribe. It helps the channel grow and lets me share more powerful stories with you.